Good day, economic students, and welcome to another version of online video learning. The focus of this video will be the United States and the global economy. So let's go over the objectives for this particular video. First, we will talk about the ever important 4 international linkages. We will cover these on the next slide. Then we'll discover and discuss some facts about international trade. Then we will talk about the rationale behind trade, why economists believe trade makes citizens of the globe better off, and we will talk about such ideas as absolute advantage, comparative advantage, specialization, and then not listed here but equally important, terms of trade and gains from trade. So part 3 is sort of the heart and soul of the economics studied in this particular section of our course. Now, not everyone believes free trade is a good idea, so we will discuss how and why governments sometimes erect trade barriers to interfere with international trade. Finally, we will talk about exchange rates. What is a dollar worth in terms of other currency? We will talk about how exchange rates are determined, and then when the dollar either appreciates or depreciates relative to other currencies, what are the economic impacts of such movements in the value of the dollar. So let's talk about the 4 international linkages. On the left-hand side, we have here conveniently the United States of America. And on the right-hand side, we have all other countries. So we're just keeping it simple here. On the left-hand side is USA. On the right-hand side, all other countries. So what do we mean by these 4 international linkages? Some of these terms you probably heard. All right, the first international linkage are trade flows, imports and exports. So, Ford Motor Company produces an F-150 at a factory in the United States. That truck is loaded on a boat and it ends up in Germany. Obviously, that is an export. The United States provides airline service to citizens around the globe. That's an export of a service. So we have exports of trades, export of trade flows, goods and services that are produced domestically in the United States and sold to citizens in other parts of the globe. Likewise, there are goods and services produced in other countries that are purchased here. There are many people who like fancy designer clothes and handbags and such. They might have come from Italy, a company such as Gucci. So they're produced in a European country and make their way over here to be purchased. All right, that's an import. Obviously, we may import some services as well. So perhaps a manufacturing firm in the United States has a difficult question to answer when it's attempting to implement a new strategy with their factory, and they call on some expert living in Sweden to advise on this particular process. So trade flows, imports and exports. Now, we will get into this in much more detail later, but if the dollar value of exports equals the dollar value of imports, the United States would have exactly balanced trade. We'll talk about that next slide. And then we'll talk about trade deficits and trade surpluses. In addition to trade flows, we have resource flows. So let's talk about capital flows first. Think about how many countries in the world you could find a McDonald's. So it's a U.S. corporation who has set up shop in a foreign country, and in this case, many countries. Coca-Cola produces its famous soft drink not only here in the good old US of A, but in many countries around the world. That is an example of a capital flow. A U.S. company which has manufacturing facilities in a foreign nation. Right? Then you talk about labor flows. Well, obviously there's many Americans who work abroad in other countries. A good friend of mine took a stint working in Japan for Bank Mellon. 3 years, ended up working as a financial expert in the banking sector for Bank Mellon in Japan. Right? Now, obviously, resource flows don't just leave the United States and head into other countries. Sometimes they flow in the other direction. So if you look at Toyota, a Japanese automobile manufacturer, they have set up manufacturing facility here in the United States. And then, of course, right now we're talking about the legal flow of labor. Right? There are many citizens around the globe who have come here to work on whether it's work visas or on a permanent basis, but have come here from other nations to participate in employment opportunities in the United States. So resource flows, capital and labor flows. Then we have technology flows, information and technology. So this is information and tech about product availability, about product pricing, about resource availability, about methodologies of producing goods and services. Same thing with technology, right? So if you think about what's going on in the world today, the unfortunate reality of 2020 and the pandemic that we're all living through, which hopefully will be over. That's currently early December of 2020, so we're getting to the end of this dreadful, dreadful year. But technology flows, scientists across the globe have been sharing information on not only the treatment of this COVID-19 disease, but on the potential cure vaccination. So there's a good example of information flows across countries. Now, on a more regular basis, we'd say that perhaps a Spanish company has perfected a new methodology for extracting some type of mineral from the ground, right? Well, when they discover this new technology, that information or technological knowledge will leave Spain and go to other countries. So information and technology flows. The last one ties it all together with where's the money going? Financial flows. As we mentioned on the previous slide, we'll talk about exchange rates. If a Japanese manufacturer produces some type of electronic circuitry, they don't want to be paid in dollars, they desire to be paid in yen. So we need financial flows to keep the entire system moving, and then we need a way to translate the prices of goods and services and the prices of resources in one country's currency in terms of another country's currency. So we'll talk about exchange rates and how exchange rates make financial flows possible. So these are our four international linkages: trade flows, resource flows, information technology flows, and financial flows. Just to make certain we are familiar with the lingo, imports and exports. So imports, like goods and services that are produced by some company in a foreign nation and purchased by Americans. Then exports, goods and services produced here in the United States and purchased by people living in other countries. So the most important idea when you talk about imports and exports is what we call the balance of trade. So obviously it's going to be a rarity that in dollar terms imports and exports exactly balance, right? So when we talk about trade balance, if the United States exported $1 trillion worth of goods and services and imported $1 trillion worth of goods and services, we'd have a trade balance. Obviously, this is highly unlikely that imports will equal exports exactly in dollar terms. If they were really close, no one would really ever talk about this particular issue. However, since the early 1970s, 1974, the United States has been running a trade deficit. So a trade deficit occurs when the total value of U.S. exports in dollar terms is less than the total value of U.S. imports. So if you add all the goods and services the United States exports, you subtract out the goods and services the United States imports, if that calculation sums to a negative, then we have a trade deficit. So in 2018, the United States had a trade deficit of approximately $618 billion. 2019, the United States had a trade deficit of about $579 billion. So that means that in 2018, the U.S. imported $618 billion more in goods and services than we exported. Now, we'll talk about this a little more detail later, but the overall trade deficit was the numbers I just mentioned. In other words, 618 trade deficit for 2018, 579 579 billion 2019 trade deficit. However, when it comes to just services, if the United States just measured imports of services versus exports of services, we would actually have a trade surplus. So it's interesting when you break down our trade, or you look a little more close at the sort of trends of trade. The United States has a trade surplus in services, which leads us on to the second idea here. If the dollar value of exports is greater than imports, we would have a trade surplus. The last point is extremely important here. This idea of imbalance must be offset, right, elsewhere. So, what did we learn in the beginning of this course? There is no such thing as a free lunch. There is always a cost. A nation that incurs a trade deficit must finance the trade deficit by one or two mechanisms. The first is by borrowing. And the United States is the world's largest debtor, D-E-B-T-O-R, debtor nation. We borrow more money than any country on earth. Now, if you're a bank, who do you want to lend money to? Well, you're most happy lending money to your most creditworthy customers who are going to pay you back. Right? Default risk is very low. So in many ways, the rest of the world sees us as a good bet, so to speak. So to finance the trade deficit, the United States can either borrow or sell off real American assets, such as commercial buildings, land, right? Even companies. So that's the two mechanisms that are available to offset the trade deficit that the United States typically incurs. Let's discuss some ideas of trade patterns regarding the United States. First, volume, in terms of volume. Both in absolute terms, so measured in absolute dollar terms, imports and exports have grown since the early 70s. And as a percentage of GDP, they have also grown as when we measure imports and exports, not just in actual dollar terms, but as a percentage of the total economy. And we will see this graphically on a future slide just down the road in a couple minutes. Now, this idea of dependence, this has two connotations or two meanings when you talk about the economic interpretation of trade and dependence. First, the United States is highly dependent on other nations for some products. In other words, we're not really efficient at or even capable of producing some particular products. One interesting product of that nature is coffee. Right? Millions of Americans consume coffee every day, and we import most of our coffee. Right? Silk, rubber, which we can make synthesized rubber, synthetic rubber, I should say. Bananas, right? So there's certain goods that we're not really gifted with the proper resources to produce these large scale. The other idea of dependence is this. Some nations are highly dependent on exports for their economic well-being. So when you measure exports as a percentage of total economic activity, it really tells a story of how dependent is that country on exports for its economic well-being. Now, trade pattern. Most of our trade is with other industrialized countries. We have some nice graphical representation of this idea. In pure dollar terms, our most significant trading partner is Canada, right? Oh, Canada, right? Just because it's mostly a marriage of convenience, right? It's so close. So that's an interesting idea of our most important trading partner in dollar terms. Then we talk about who do we have our big trade deficit with? No secret here, and we'll see another representation of this down the road here, that our big trade deficit is with China, right? It's not completely a one-way street, but a large portion of the U.S. trade deficit is really the reasoning is focused on one country in our relationship with just China. Something we will talk about later, as I alluded to earlier, are these financial linkages when we talk about exchange rates. So let's review here. This is a total GDP for the world, and we break it down per country. So the United States produces just under 24% of the global economic output. Right here it says 23.6%. China produces about 15.5%. So if you take 25 and 15, the United States and China is roughly 40% of the world's output. As a matter of fact, if you take that and add another 10 from Germany and Japan, you got four countries, United States, China, Germany, and Japan, that produce half the world's output. Right? So this is just a good review of GDP and the idea of which nations produce what percentage of total economic output for the world. What are we representing here? All right, the top 20 traders. Now, not traders like somebody turned your back on you, right? These are economic trade, okay? So look at the columns. We have the countries in column 1, then we have international trade of goods, international trade of services, and of course the total international trade of goods and services. So we take column 2 plus column 3, and adds up to column 4, right? So if we take the whole world, right, the whole world generated $32,430,000,000,000 worth of goods traded, $9,635,000,000,000 worth of services traded, so a total of just over $42 trillion worth of trade that is flowing around the globe. All right, the United States is still number one if you measure trade in dollar terms of goods traded and services traded. All right, 3.7 trillion in goods, 1.2 trillion in services, for a total of 4,921,000,000,000. However, if you took the European Union as one economic entity, the EU would actually surpass the United States as an economic unit. Now, obviously, that's not really a proper comparison because there's many countries in the EU, but it's one way of sort of explaining it. So the second largest trader is China. All right, $3,686,000,000,000 in goods. Look how much fewer in services, 656, less than $1 trillion worth of services traded, 4,342,000,000,000 in total. And then we got Germany, UK, Japan, France, Netherlands, Hong Kong, South Korea, Italy, Canada, Belgium, India, Singapore, Mexico, Spain, Switzerland, Taiwan, Russia, and Ireland, rounding out the top 20. So these are the most important countries when it comes to trade. Now, one important idea before we move on. We already said this, but it's worth reiterating. Most of the U.S. trade is with other modern industrialized countries. So this makes sense when you look at this chart because it tells you which countries are involved with the trade in dollar terms. Reflecting back on something we just mentioned, the idea of dependency, some countries are highly dependent on exports for their economic well-being. Let's look at Belgium and the Netherlands. 91% of Belgium's economic production is exported elsewhere. The Netherlands, 75%. I took the bother of looking up what these two countries export. A lot of machinery, chemicals, minerals. Belgium actually I was kind of curious there, but some diamonds. All right. So if you look at Germany, though, a country we're really familiar with, almost half of their economic output is exported. Right. Now it's funny because if you look in pure dollar terms, the United States exports more in pure dollar terms than Germany, but as a percentage of our GDP, exports are only 12%. Canada is an interesting country because a lot of what Canada exports is what we would call land resources, because Canada is a giant place that's not densely populated, but blessed with lots of natural resources when it comes to land resources. All right, what is the purpose of this chart? This chart is going to demonstrate how imports and exports have grown both as a percentage of GDP and in real terms since 1975. So whenever you have a chart, make sure you identify what's being measured on both the horizontal and the vertical axis. So in the horizontal axis is simple, it's just time. 1975, 80, 85, 90, 95, 2000 through 2015, you get the idea. Right? That's horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we're measuring percentage of GDP, imports and exports as a percentage of GDP. Okay? So the red is, we'll call it line, even though it's not straight. The red represents exports as a percentage of GDP over time. The blue represents imports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP over time. Right? Now, if you go back to 1975, imports and exports were both roughly 5% of GDP. You can see that as the starting point where the two of them are nearly together. And up top it tells you that in real terms, or in dollar terms, exports were 245 billion and imports were 252 billion. Then you can see that how each imports and exports have grown over time. So they've grown in real terms, but they've also grown in economic importance, right? The idea that as a percentage of our total economy, imports and exports have grown, right? Now they've grown to their current level where exports are roughly 11.4, 11.5% of GDP, close to 12 sometimes, right? And imports are about 14.8% of GDP, somewhere in that neighborhood, right? So you can see that imports and exports have grown over time. The last idea is also important here. If you look at the convergence and divergence, in other words, when imports and exports are close to each other in dollar terms and when they grow further apart from each other. So 1975, 1982, 1991, you can see that imports and exports were nearly the same. In other words, we were really close to having a trade balance, or in other terms, the trade deficit had narrowed significantly. We tend to find out this happens, other things equal, ceteris paribus, our Latin other things equal assumption, when the economy is experiencing a recession. When the economy goes into an economic downturn, Americans find foreign goods less attractive because many of these are your upscale type products, such as, maybe your Mercedes-Benz or your Gucci, your designer watches, or your Swiss Army knife, right? That one might be an exaggeration. Interestingly enough, there was another recession in 2000, but you could see that the trade deficit actually widened during the early 2000 recession. Right after, right when George Bush took office. Most economists believe that the reason for this is because by this point we were importing a large number of we would call necessities from China, such as textiles, such as clothing. But the trade deficit did narrow significantly during the 2007 financial crisis and the economic downturn which transpired thereafter. Okay, so this is U.S. top trading partners if we look at imports and exports. First, let's find our good friends Canada, right? If you look top on the list of exports and third on the list of imports, right? Or third on the list of imports and second on the list of, first on the list of exports. So in dollar terms, our most important trading partner is good old Canada when you add up imports and exports, right? The elephant in the room is obvious, and we'll discuss that more on the next slide. Look at the tremendous dollar value of imports from China, right? Now, it shouldn't be a surprise because we're trying to emphasize this point. The United States trades with mostly other modern industrialized countries. Mexico, right? South Central America, Japan, Germany, South Korea, right? So this really shouldn't be all that big of a surprise. France, right? So if we eliminated China from the picture, which we can't, obviously that's a lofty, ridiculous goal, but if China was not in the picture, the United States would pretty much have a relative balance of trade. Now, here is that elephant in the room. So if you go from 1985 through last year, 2019, you can see the significant increase in the trade deficit with our Chinese friends, right? So if we look at imports and exports over time, it shows you that yes, exports have grown from nearly nothing, in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, to a significant number today. But so have exports, and exports have grown exponentially. Now, obviously, much has been discussed about this particular relationship. Donald Trump was fond of using tariffs to address the imbalance of trade with the United States and China. Right? At this point, December 2020, it has already been determined that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. It will be interesting to see Biden's approach to trade with China. He might not take quite such a hard tone with China as did Donald Trump, but I think the general consensus, not only among Americans but European countries, is that something has to be done about this particular issue. Now, we will talk about how and why nations erect barriers to trade later in this particular lecture, but for now, let's just suffice it to say that one of the big issues with China is China failing to play fairly, right? In other words, if China was playing by the rules, there would be far less gripe among European countries and the United States in two particular areas. One, China makes it rather challenging for foreign companies to set up shop in China. And two, China is blatantly ignoring WTO, World Trade Organization rules, when it comes to such regulations such as respecting copyrights and technology patents. This is a huge issue. We're talking about stealing trade secrets. The United States and the European Union have accused China of either thwarting or completely ignoring or just not even showing any concern for the rules set forth for the WTO when you talk about fair trade. When I was a little kid, I used to love to play that game with my grandmother where you turn the cards over and you try to pick the match, right? And maybe there was like a whole bunch of different characters, and of course one of them was the old maid, and everyone wanted to get the old maid. So what does that have to do with our little list here? Okay, so this is select principal U.S. exports and imports of goods. Now, it's 2012, but although the numbers have changed over the last 8 years, the actual products have not, okay, or the actual goods have not, I should say. So what do we notice about the select exports and select imports of the United States? So on the left we have the principal exports of the U.S., and on the right we have the principal imports of the U.S. Interestingly enough, right, many of these are the same on both lists. Let's go through. What? Metals, metals. Pharmaceuticals, pharmaceuticals. General equipment, general equipment. Computers, computers. Right? Chemicals, chemicals. It's interesting, right? Even petroleum and energy products. And this was before the moratorium on oil. So we had a 40-year moratorium on exporting oil. The United States was not allowed to export oil, but now we've lifted some of that moratorium. So if you look up top, we import a bunch of petroleum. We're actually exporting some oil now as well. What does this tell us? We already know that most of our trade is with other modern industrialized nations. It also tells us that people around the globe like choices. Right? People around the globe like choices. We looked at this information on a previous slide with updated data. This demonstrates U.S. exports and imports by goods by area. So we talked a little bit about this before in a few slides ago. But I like this slide because it also provides percentage of the total. In other words, in 2012, we exported $294 billion worth of goods to Canada and imported $329 billion worth of goods to Canada. But if you break it down as a percentage of our total trade, 19% of our exports went to Canada and 14% of our imports came from Canada. So it's a good way to look at it. Now, one of the other interesting trends in trade, if you look down at what we call OPEC, because we already talked about China and the big issue with China, but if OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, all right, so it says OPEC countries. Notice in 2012 we exported just $81 billion worth of goods to these countries and imported $182 billion worth of goods. Now when you talk goods, obviously it's all oil. Organization of Petroleum Exporting Nations. And these countries are Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates. Not exactly our closest allies, we would say. So the energy boom in the United States, fracking and directional drilling, not only plays a big role in reducing the trade deficit, the overall trade deficit, it is an interesting geopolitical event because we've been importing oil from Organization of Petroleum Exporting countries who aren't necessarily our closest of allies. So when you talk about trade, you can look at the numbers, but you can also look at the geopolitical situation, which is more important sometimes than the absolute numbers. This is the Wall Street Journal breakdown of 2016 U.S. trade deficit. So this is really telling story because it just spells out for us what particular goods are adding to the trade deficit and which particular goods are we'll say, pushing the ball in the other direction, trade surplus, and then services down bottom. So let's talk about goods first. All right, $192 billion worth of auto engines and parts as far as our deficit. $94 billion in clothing, crude and fuel oil, another $80 billion, $73 billion in cell phones. That's an interesting one, especially when you talk about China producing our Apple iPhones. I'm not an iPhone user. I'm an Android guy, but I know a lot of people like those iPhones. All right. Computers and accessories, almost $70 billion. Here's one that we're going to talk about, when we discuss the decision by governments to intervene in free trade and reasons why countries may erect trade barriers. So pharmaceutical drugs, you're like, wow, man, we have a $58 billion deficit in pharmaceutical drugs. And which is ironic because the United States, these big pharmaceutical companies, they develop a lot of these drugs, but then we produce them somewhere else, and that somewhere else is a lot of the times China. So when you talk about reasons why a country might object to the free market system of trade and the natural forces which end up allocating resources globally to produce products which lead to imports and exports, we may question this dependency on a foreign country, especially a country that we don't have the greatest relationship with, or we'll say a tenuous relationship at best. So I think we're going to, see a reevaluation or perform a rethink here on whether this is the best policy. And the same goes for the next particular type of good, telecommunications equipment. Think about the communications network in the United States. When you talk about networking equipment and transistors and transformers, and you need these to make the communication system in the United States work, you don't want to be dependent on some foreign country to produce them. Even if the country is an ally, the pandemic has taught us that it's not always that accessible to acquire goods when the whole world is worried about some type of gosh darn virus. All right. I talk about toys and televisions and such. All right. Also, when you look at surplus, we have a huge surplus in civilian aircrafts and engines, $65 billion. But the next one, soybeans. Look at the date here, 2016. This is right before Donald Trump took office. So this used to be one of the strengths of U.S. exporting, was our agricultural exports. China was a big purchaser of soybeans. Donald Trump levied a large amount of tariffs on Chinese imports. China retaliated by levying tariffs on agricultural exports from the United States to China. This was particularly bad for farmers. And the reason why it's not only an immediate concern, but more of a long-term worry, there's a possibility that these soy exports will not return all that quickly because China looked elsewhere. They sourced these soybeans from South American country, Brazil, in replacement of the ones they were purchasing from the United States. So when you look and say, trade wars and trade spats, It's really challenging because you want to force a country that's not living up to the WTO standards, World Trade Organization standards, to play by the rules, but at the same time, you might end up sort of shooting yourself in the economic foot. All right, newsprint's a big export for the United States. It's funny how that's under a good, I would label that as service anymore, because I don't know about you, but I never pick up a physical paper. I just use a good old phone and computer to read stories. Our exports of services, intellectual property, financial services are two that you could have thought about on your own, so to speak. But travel and tourism, also a big export for the United States. Trade has boomed across the globe. If you look at post-World War II, it boomed in first industrialized countries, and now it's boomed in many, many countries across the globe. And these are the reasons why trade has boomed or blossomed so much, the rapid growth in trade. And most of these are just basic common sense. Transportation technology, the ease of transporting goods, services, and resources, and the efficiency of keeping track of those goods, services, and resources. Obviously, that plays into here. The second one, the communications technology. All right, but this third point is interesting. The World Trade Organization convinced most countries of the globe to participate in trade according to and by a certain set of standards. And that is to say that they would lower tariffs for the benefit of all. Now, we've seen a reversal of this trend since the Trump inauguration, right, where Trump is emphasizing this America First idea. But economists generally believe tariffs make all nations worse off because they have retaliatory effects among the participants. We're going to talk about the barriers to trade in a few moments. But it is important to talk about why certain countries have soured on the benefits of trade. In the next section of this video, we're going to talk about the theoretical advantages of specialization in trade. Economists believe specializing limited or scarce resources into producing a product in which a nation enjoys what is referred to as a comparative advantage increases total output, and therefore citizens across the globe consume than they would otherwise. They're able to escape the limitations of their domestic production possibility frontier. And declining tariffs facilitates a certain percentage of this efficiency. But many countries feel as if the promises of trade have not really lived up to the hype. In other words, they don't really feel better off, and that some of the low to middle income workers who've been misallocated as far as their employment opportunities and their occupational advancement because of trade are starting to really question the merits of trade. We will finish this video with a simple list of the world's largest exporters. This is 2019. So in 2019, last year, China became the world's largest exporters when you talk about in dollar terms. So China exported $2.644 billion worth of goods and services, mostly goods when we talk about China. It was 18.4% of their GDP. In the United States, it's one of those things where people in glass houses can't really cast stones, because the United States exports a megaton of goods and services as well, to the tune of $2 trillion, almost $500 billion worth of goods and services, and our exports about 11.7% of GDP. Germany, number 3, Japan 4, and the UK ranks out the top 5 as far as, in dollar terms, the largest exporters in the world. So these are top 25 countries across the globe in terms of exports measured in millions of dollars, and also represented as a percentage of each country's GDP. See you in the next video.